Sir, I need you to step back and provide some identification.
Before that happens,
You match
explain
a
what law you
description.
believe I'm violating. A description or simply an assumption?
Now turn around and place your hands behind your back.
Officer Nathan Rivers had served with the Atlanta Police Department for 6 years. 6 years that included 11 complaints, each dismissed or resolved with minimal consequences. Among fellow officers, he was known for what they politely called aggressive community engagement, stopping individuals based on instincts, gut reactions, and profiles he had created in his own mind. His field training officers had documented concerns about implicit bias during his probation period. But those warnings had been buried in his file, never addressed. One Friday evening in Atlanta's Buckhead district, Rivers's pattern of profiling collided with a federal agent who understood the law better than he did. And the encounter would cost the department $4.7 million and expose a systemic failure that had been ignored for years. Special Agent Malcolm Reyes had spent 14 years investigating organized crime for the FBI. 14 years of wiretaps, surveillance operations, and undercover assignments that dismantled trafficking rings and placed dangerous criminals behind bars. He testified in federal court 37 times. He coordinated with international law enforcement partners. His record was spotless. His credentials were unquestionable. That Friday evening, he was simply trying to meet a colleague for dinner, walking down a busy street in broad daylight, dressed in business casual clothing, carrying nothing but his phone and wallet. No crime, no suspicious behavior, no reason for any law enforcement contact. But Officer Rivers saw him and decided in that moment that something was wrong. And that decision would shatter careers, spark protests, and force uncomfortable questions about who police perceive as threats and why. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these deserve to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth into the light. Buckhead is one of Atlanta's most affluent districts. High-end shopping, upscale restaurants, luxury condominiums, and corporate offices. The streets are clean, the sidewalks busy with professionals, tourists, and residents. It's the kind of neighborhood where police presence is usually subtle, where most encounters are cordial, where the assumption is that everyone belongs, unless you're black. It was 6:47 p.m. on a Friday in early October. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across Peachtree Road. The weather was perfect mid-70s, clear skies, a light breeze. People walk dogs. Couples head to dinner reservations. Business professionals travel home after long weeks. Special Agent Malcolm Reyes had spent the day at the FBI's Atlanta field office, reviewing surveillance footage from an ongoing racketeering investigation. It had been tedious work hours of watching grainy video, documenting movements, building timelines. He was tired and ready for a good meal and relaxed conversation. He'd arranged to meet his colleague, Special Agent Jennifer Owens, at a steakhouse 6 blocks from the field office. Rather than drive, he decided to walk, stretch his legs, clear his mind, enjoy the evening air. Reyes was 41 years old, fit, clean-cut. He wore khaki slacks, a navy blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, brown leather shoes. His FBI credentials were in his front pocket, as always. His service weapon was holstered at his hip, concealed beneath his shirt. He looked exactly like what he was, a federal law enforcement professional, off-duty but always ready. He walked with purpose, but not urgency, checking his phone occasionally, nodding at people he passed. He belonged there. He had every right to be there. He wasn't doing anything wrong. But to Officer Nathan Rivers, something about Malcolm Reyes triggered suspicion. And that suspicion, rooted in bias rather than evidence, was about to explode into a confrontation that would make national headlines. Nathan Rivers was 29 years old. He joined the Atlanta Police Department 6 years earlier. Fresh from the academy with idealistic ideas about fighting crime and protecting communities. But those ideals had quickly shifted into something darker, a belief that certain people in certain places were automatically suspicious. Rivers had generated his first complaint within 5 months of solo patrol. He stopped a black woman in her Mercedes, convinced the car was stolen. It wasn't. She was a cardiologist driving home from the hospital. The complaint alleged racial profiling. Internal Affairs investigated, found insufficient evidence of bias, and closed the case with a recommendation for cultural sensitivity training. Rivers attended a half-day workshop and returned to patrol. The second complaint came 7 months later. A black businessman in a suit walking through a parking garage. Rivers stopped him, demanded ID, questioned why he was there. The man owned the building. Another complaint, another investigation, another training recommendation. Over the next 5 years, 9 more complaints followed. Each one told the same story. Rivers stopping black professionals in affluent areas, demanding explanations for their presence, refusing to accept that they belonged. Each complaint was investigated. Each investigation found insufficient evidence of intentional bias. Each time, Rivers received additional training and remained on patrol. His supervisors knew about the pattern. His file was thick with incident reports and civilian complaints, but no one ever asked the obvious question. At what point does a pattern become proof? Rivers had learned to justify his stops carefully, fit a description, suspicious behavior, community concern. He knew the language that would satisfy incident reports and protect him from discipline. By the time he encountered Malcolm Reyes, Nathan Rivers had been trained 11 times on implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and constitutional policing, and he'd learned nothing. Do you think officers with 10 or more complaints should be automatically removed from patrol? Drop your answer below. Rivers was on patrol in Buckhead, driving slowly through the district, scanning pedestrians and vehicles. It was part of what he called proactive policing, looking for anything that didn't fit anyone who seemed out of place. He saw Malcolm Reyes from a block away. A black man walking alone, dressed casually but not poorly, moving with confidence through an affluent, predominantly white neighborhood. In Rivers's mind, shaped by 6 years of unchecked bias, something was wrong. The clothes were too nice to be legitimate. The confidence was suspicious. The presence was unexplained. He pulled his patrol car to the curb and watched. Reyes walked past a row of high-end retail stores, glanced at his phone, continued walking. Normal behavior, the actions of someone going somewhere they had every right to be. But Rivers had already decided what he was seeing. This was someone who didn't belong, someone worth questioning. He got out of his car and followed on foot, maintaining distance, watching. Reyes stopped at a crosswalk, waited for the light, crossed. Rivers crossed behind him, closing the gap. When Reyes reached the next block, Rivers called out, "Sir, excuse me, sir." Reyes stopped and turned. He saw the uniform, the badge, the posture of authority. He'd been a federal agent long enough to know when an interaction was heading somewhere problematic. "Yes, officer." Reyes's voice was calm, professional. Rivers approached, his hand resting near his belt. "Sir, I need you to step back and show me some identification." Reyes didn't move. "Before I do that, tell me what law you think I'm breaking." Rivers's jaw tightened. "You fit a description." Reyes's eyes narrowed slightly. "A description or an assumption?" "Both." Rivers stepped closer, his voice hardening. "Now turn around. Hands behind your back." This was the moment. The moment where an officer's bias collided with a citizen's rights. Where authority met knowledge. Where the balance of power shifted in ways Rivers hadn't anticipated. Reyes stood perfectly still. His voice remained calm, but the authority in it was unmistakable. "Special Agent Malcolm Reyes, FBI, and you just made a very serious mistake." Rivers froze. His face flushed. But instead of backing down, instead of de-escalating, his pride kicked in. "I don't care if you're FBI, CIA, or the president. You fit a description, and I'm detaining you." "What description?" Reyes asked evenly. "Be specific. What crime was reported? When? Where and what description am I supposedly matching?" Rivers stammered. "There was a call about suspicious activity in this area." "When was the call?" "Earlier today." "How much earlier?" "What time? What location specifically? What was the described suspect wearing?" "Height, weight, distinguishing features." Rivers had no answers because there was no call. There was no description. There was only bias wrapped in the language of law enforcement authority. Reyes could see it on Rivers's face. The realization that he'd been caught in a lie, the panic that comes from knowing you've overstepped, but feeling too committed to retreat. "Officer," Reyes said, his voice dropping into something colder. "You have 2 choices right now. You can acknowledge that you have no reasonable suspicion, no probable cause, and no legal basis for this stop. Or you can continue, and I promise you, it will end your career." Should officers be required to cite specific verifiable information before any detention? Let me know what you think. Rivers's hand moved to his handcuffs. "Turn around now." Reyes didn't move. "I'm not turning around. I'm not complying with an unlawful order. You have no grounds for detention. You're resisting. I'm exercising my Fourth Amendment rights." There's a difference. A small crowd had begun to gather. A woman pulled out her phone and started recording. A couple stopped and watched. A security guard from a nearby building approached. concerned. Rivers felt the eyes on him, felt the pressure, felt his authority being challenged in public, and instead of recognizing that he was wrong, he doubled down. Last warning, Rivers said. Hands behind your back or you're under arrest for obstruction. Reyes pulled his FBI credentials from his pocket slowly, deliberately, every movement visible. He held them up. The gold shield caught the street light. The identification card was clear. Special Agent Malcolm Reyes, FBI, badge number 7854, Atlanta Field Office. You can verify this with one phone call. Reyes's voice was steady, but the anger underneath was palpable. You stopped me without cause. You demanded identification without reasonable suspicion. You threatened arrest because I asserted my rights, and now you're about to arrest a federal agent simply because your ego won't allow you to admit you were wrong. Rivers stared at the credentials. They appeared genuine, yet he had convinced himself they couldn't be, that this must be some kind of trick, that criminals used fake badges all the time. Those might be counterfeit, Rivers said. Reyes's expression stayed calm, but something in his eyes hardened. They're not, and you know they're not. But you've gone too far into this stop, so committed to the story you created that you can't back away now. Turn around. No. Rivers grabbed Reyes's arm. Reyes pulled back instinctively, not violently, not aggressively, but firmly. Don't touch me. You have no lawful authority to detain me. Rivers pulled harder, trying to twist Reyes around. Reyes kept his balance, his training obvious. He didn't strike back, didn't escalate, but he didn't surrender either. You're under arrest for resisting an officer. Rivers shouted loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. The woman recording spoke up. He's FBI. He showed you his badge. What are you doing? Rivers ignored her. He tried to force Reyes's arms behind his back. Reyes resisted the attempt, using his weight and stance to block it. For 30 seconds, they struggled. Rivers trying to assert control, Reyes refusing to submit unlawfully. And then a voice cut through the chaos. Rivers, stand down. Sergeant Patricia Wolfe had been driving past when she noticed the commotion. A 23-year veteran, she recognized trouble immediately. She parked quickly and approached, her hand raised in a calming gesture. Step back, Rivers, now. Rivers released Reyes's arm, but didn't step away. Sarge, this individual was acting suspicious and refused to cooperate. I said step back. Wolfe's voice carried the authority of 2 decades of experience. Rivers stepped back, breathing heavily, his face flushed. Wolfe turned to Reyes. Sir, I'm Sergeant Wolfe. Can you explain what happened? Reyes straightened his shirt, composed but clearly angry. Your officer stopped me without cause, demanded identification without reasonable suspicion, and attempted to arrest me when I questioned his authority. I identified myself as FBI. I showed him my credentials. He raised them again. He called them fake and tried to detain me anyway. Wolfe took the credentials and inspected them carefully. Her expression changed immediately. Recognition, then concern, then something close to anger. These are legitimate, she said quietly. She looked at Rivers. You tried to arrest a federal agent? I didn't know. You didn't verify. There's a difference. She turned back to Reyes. Agent Reyes, I apologize. This stop was inappropriate. Reyes nodded, but said nothing. His eyes were fixed on Rivers, who stood off to the side, still trying to understand how badly he had misjudged the situation. Why do some officers double down instead of admitting mistakes? Comment your thoughts. The woman who had been recording approached Sergeant Wolfe. I have the whole thing on video from the beginning. Can I see it? The woman played the footage. It showed everything. Rivers approaching without cause. Reyes requesting legal justification. Rivers ordering Reyes to turn around. Reyes presenting his credentials. Rivers calling them fake. The physical struggle. Wolfe's face darkened as she watched. Ma'am, would you be willing to send that to the department? I'm sending it everywhere. The woman said, this is wrong. That man didn't do anything. Another witness stepped forward. The security guard from the nearby building. I saw everything too. That officer stopped him for no reason. The gentleman was just walking. Wolfe looked at Rivers. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but the anger beneath it was obvious. Go back to your vehicle. Don't say anything. Don't move. Wait for a supervisor. Rivers walked back to his patrol car, moving like someone in a daze. Wolfe turned to Reyes. Agent Reyes, I know this was wrong. You have every right to file a complaint, and I will personally make sure you receive all body camera footage and incident reports. Reyes nodded. I'll be filing more than a complaint, Sergeant. I'll be filing a federal civil rights lawsuit. This wasn't a mistake. This was profiling. And I'm willing to bet it's not the first time he's done it. Wolf didn't disagree. I understand. And honestly, you're probably right. A supervisor arrived 10 minutes later. Lieutenant David Morrison, a 16-year veteran with a reputation for integrity. Wolf briefed him, showed him the video from the witness's phone, and explained what she observed. Morrison listened, his expression grim. Then he walked over to Rivers's patrol car. Officer Rivers, you're suspended effective immediately. Internal Affairs will contact you within 24 hours. Do not discuss this incident with anyone. Do not post about it on social media. Go home. Rivers nodded silently. Morrison approached Reyes next. Agent Reyes, I'm Lieutenant Morrison. I've watched the video. I've heard the witness statements, and I want you to know that what happened here is completely unacceptable. We will cooperate fully with any investigation, and this officer will face consequences. Reyes's voice remained controlled, but the anger was still there. Lieutenant, I've worked with local police departments all across this country. I've coordinated joint operations. I've testified alongside local officers. I have never been stopped, questioned, and physically grabbed by an officer who refused to believe my credentials. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was bias, plain and simple. Morrison didn't argue. You're right, and I'm sorry. By that evening, the witness video had been uploaded to social media. Within hours, it went viral. FBI agent profiled and nearly arrested in Atlanta while walking to dinner. Federal officer grabbed by cop who refused to believe his badge. $4.7 million lawsuit filed after agent stopped without cause. The story exploded. Local news, national news, civil rights organizations, FBI statements. The video had everything. Clear evidence of profiling, an officer refusing to verify obvious credentials, a federal agent remaining calm while his rights were violated. Should body cameras automatically upload to independent servers in real time? Drop your answer. The FBI's Atlanta field office issued a statement within 12 hours. We are aware of an incident involving one of our agents and the Atlanta Police Department. The matter is under review, and we are cooperating with all appropriate investigations. The safety and rights of our personnel are paramount. Behind the scenes, the response was far less diplomatic. FBI leadership was furious. The Atlanta Police Department's Internal Affairs Division launched an immediate investigation. The Department of Justice opened a civil rights inquiry. What they discovered was damning. Officer Nathan Rivers had 11 complaints over 6 years. 11. All involving stops of black individuals in affluent areas. All alleging racial profiling. All closed without meaningful discipline. The pattern was undeniable. Year 1, 2 complaints, both alleging stops without reasonable suspicion. Outcome, training recommended, no discipline. Year 2, 1 complaint, alleged unlawful detention. Outcome, insufficient evidence, case closed. Year 3, 3 complaints, all alleging racial profiling in Buckhead. Outcome, additional bias training required, no suspension. Year 4, 2 complaints, 1 involving physical contact during a stop. Outcome, counseling by supervisor, return to full duty. Year 5, 1 complaint, alleged false arrest. Outcome, case settled by the city before formal investigation completed. Year 6, 2 complaints, including the Malcolm Reyes incident. The internal review uncovered something worse. Supervisors had identified the pattern 3 years earlier. A memo from a lieutenant to a captain specifically noted Rivers's concerning tendency to initiate contacts with black individuals in predominantly white neighborhoods without clear justification. The recommendation in that memo reassignment to administrative duties, pending comprehensive retraining. The outcome memo filed, no action taken. The Atlanta Police Department had known Nathan Rivers was a liability. They documented it. They discussed it internally, and they did nothing. Civil rights attorneys contacted Agent Reyes within days. The case was straightforward. Unlawful stop, attempted unlawful detention, violation of civil rights, and a documented pattern of similar conduct by the officer. The lawsuit named Officer Nathan Rivers, his direct supervisor Sergeant William Kramer, Lieutenant Edward Monroe, who had written the ignored memo, and the Atlanta Police Department. The allegations were extensive. Unlawful stop without reasonable suspicion in violation of the Fourth Amendment. Racial profiling and discrimination in violation of federal civil rights statutes. Attempted false arrest and false imprisonment. Use of force without legal justification. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. Failure to train, supervise, and discipline officers with documented patterns of constitutional violations. Deliberate indifference to citizens' rights by departmental leadership. The city's legal team reviewed the evidence. The witness video showing the entire encounter. Rivers' history of complaints. The internal memo documenting supervisory awareness of the issue. Body camera footage confirming Reyes's account of events. Their conclusion indefensible. Settlement negotiations began within 3 months. The city offered $2 million. Reyes's attorneys countered at $16 million, citing the egregious nature of the stop, the documented pattern of abuse, and the department's knowing failure to act. They settled at $4.7 million, one of the largest civil rights settlements in Atlanta's history, for a stop that did not result in arrest or injury. The settlement included provisions beyond money. Mandatory reform of the complaint review process. Creation of an early intervention system to identify officers with complaint patterns. Quarterly audits of all officer stops analyzed for racial disparities. A community oversight board with subpoena power. Public reporting of complaint statistics and outcomes. Officer Nathan Rivers was terminated 9 weeks after the incident. The termination letter was precise and damning. Officer Rivers engaged in conduct that violated constitutional protections, department policy, and the public trust. Despite numerous complaints and training interventions over 6 years, Officer Rivers continued a pattern of discriminatory enforcement. His actions endangered public safety, damaged community relations, and exposed the department to significant legal liability. His employment is terminated for cause effective immediately. Rivers' certification was revoked. His name was entered into the National Decertification Index. He would never work in law enforcement again. He attempted to appeal, arguing that the termination was excessive and that he had simply followed his training. The appeal was denied. The evidence was overwhelming. Rivers issued a statement through his attorney. "I made serious mistakes in judgment that I deeply regret. I accept responsibility for my actions and apologize to Agent Reyes and the community." The apology rang hollow. 11 complaints, 6 years, hundreds of stops. The pattern was not an error, it was a decision. Should officers with 5 or more civil rights complaints lose their badge automatically? Let me know in the comments. The Department of Justice investigation went beyond Nathan Rivers. They reviewed the Atlanta Police Department's entire complaint review system. What they discovered was institutional failure at every level. Key findings. 1. Complaint review failures. Complaints were evaluated individually, never combined to identify patterns. An officer could accumulate 10 complaints of the same type, and each would still be treated as an isolated event. 2. Inadequate training. Officers received biased training, but there was no evaluation of whether the training actually changed behavior. Officers attended workshops, signed paperwork, and returned to patrol with no follow-up. 3. Supervisory negligence. Supervisors were aware of problematic officers, but faced pressure to maintain staffing numbers. Problem officers were easier to keep than to replace. For lack of accountability, department culture prioritized protecting officers rather than protecting constitutional rights. Complaints were treated as attacks on police rather than opportunities for improvement. 5. No early intervention. Despite having data on complaint patterns, the department had no system to intervene before officers like Rivers caused serious harm. The DOJ issued a harsh report with mandatory reforms, implementation of an early intervention system within 6 months, independent review of all complaints alleging racial bias, quarterly statistical analysis of all stops, searches, and uses of force with racial disparities reported publicly. De-escalation training for all officers with annual recertification. Community advisory board with authority to review and recommend discipline. Federal monitoring for 5 years. The reforms were court-ordered, not suggestions, requirements. Atlanta's mayor issued a public apology. What happened to Special Agent Reyes should never have occurred. It represents a failure of supervision, training, and accountability. We are committed to reform, and we will rebuild the community's trust. Special Agent Malcolm Reyes testified before the City Council during the reform process. His testimony was measured but powerful. "I am a federal agent. I have resources. I have legal knowledge. I have institutional backing. And even with all of that, I was profiled, stopped unlawfully, and physically grabbed by an officer who refused to believe I had the right to walk down a public street. Now imagine what happens to people who do not have what I have. People who do not know their rights, people who cannot afford attorneys, people who do not have badges or federal agencies backing them up. Officer Rivers stopped me because he could not imagine that a black man belonged in Buckhead. That is the reality. And until departments confront that reality, admit it, and actively work to change it, this will keep happening. The question is not whether Officer Rivers was biased. The evidence is clear. The question is why the department allowed him to continue that pattern for 6 years. Why 11 complaints were not enough to trigger intervention. Why a lieutenant's memo recommending reassignment was ignored. Those are the systemic failures that enabled what happened to me. And those are the failures you must fix. The council chamber was silent when he finished. This was not just about Nathan Rivers making a poor decision. This was about a system that enabled, protected, and perpetuated biased policing. Rivers did not develop his pattern in isolation. He quickly learned that he could stop black individuals in white neighborhoods, that complaints would not lead to consequences, that supervisors would defend him, that the system would protect him. Every complaint that was dismissed taught him he was untouchable. Every training session he attended without real accountability reinforced that lesson. Every year he remained on patrol despite the growing evidence told him that his behavior was acceptable. The Atlanta Police Department created Nathan Rivers. Not intentionally perhaps, but through negligence, indifference, and a culture that valued protecting officers over protecting citizens' rights. And Malcolm Reyes paid the price. Not with his life, not with physical injury, but with his dignity, with his sense of safety in his own city, with the knowledge that even his credentials, his service, his federal badge were not enough to protect him from being seen as a threat. This is what systemic racism looks like when it wears a badge. It is not always white hoods and burning crosses. Sometimes it is an officer who simply feels that someone does not belong. Sometimes it is a supervisor who writes a memo and does nothing. Sometimes it is a department that treats patterns as anomalies and complaints as inconveniences. And when that system is empowered by law, by authority, by qualified immunity and police unions and political protection, it does not just harm individuals. It corrupts the entire relationship between police and communities. Nathan Rivers' career is finished. That is justice. The city paid $4.7 million. That is accountability. The department implemented reforms. That is progress. But none of that changes what happened to Malcolm Reyes. None of that erases the humiliation of being grabbed on a public street. None of that restores the presumption that he belongs in his own city. The real question is whether these reforms will last, whether the early intervention system will actually intervene, whether supervisors will act on warning signs before the 11th complaint, whether training will change behavior instead of simply checking boxes. Because if we do not fundamentally change how departments handle officers like Nathan Rivers, if we do not make it impossible for patterns to be ignored, then we are simply waiting for the next stop, the next victim, the next lawsuit. Comment below if you believe departments should face federal oversight after any $1 million plus civil rights settlement. And if you think these stories matter, if you believe accountability requires visibility, if you want to see real change in how police interact with communities, then hit that subscribe button because we will keep telling these stories. We will keep exposing the patterns. We will keep demanding that the system work for everyone, not just some. This is not just about one officer or one federal agent. It is about the world we are building, the accountability we demand, and the rights we refuse to surrender.